world is so big and there's a lot of things to learn and explore.
But before anything else, let us focus on ourselves and know how our body works, especially in our movements. So I'm gonna tackle about movement and its connection with the nervous system.
Let's now have an overview about the nervous system. There are two types of nervous system. First, the central nervous system or the CNS. It is composed of the brain that is the processing center of all information and the spinal cord which signals to the brain and from the brain. Next is the peripheral nervous system. It is a nervous system outside the brain and spinal cord, under the PNS or the motor neurons and sensory neurons. Motor neurons carry impulses away from the CNS to muscles and glands, while sensory neurons carry information to the CNS from the sensory organs. Under the motor neurons or somatic and autonomic nervous system, which controls voluntary and involuntary responses. And under autonomic nervous system are the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. Now, let's discuss about movement. What is movement? Movement is obviously a process of moving, a change of place or position in a certain period of time. There are movements in every actions that we do. Just like in running, walking, or in by just simply tying your shoelace.
And all of this movement depends on muscle contraction. And there are three categories of vertebrae muscles.
And these are the three categories of vertebrae muscles. 1. Smooth muscles. Smooth muscles control the digestive system and other organs. 2. Skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscles is also known as striated muscles. It controls body movements in relation to the environment. And lastly, the cardiac muscle or the heart muscle.
Each muscle is composed of many fibers, and each muscle fiber receives information from only one axon. But that given axon is connected with more than one muscle fibers.
So as you can see, this given axon is connected with more than one muscle fiber. And there is a synapse between the motor neuron axon and the muscle fiber. And that is called neuromuscular junction. Every axon releases acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction. And this acetylcholine always excites the muscles to contract. Also, a deficit of acetylcholine in the muscles impairs movement. There is an autoimmune disease which is called myasthenia gravis, which the immune system forms antibodies that attack the acetylcholine receptors at neuromuscular junction, causing weakness and rapid fatigue of the skeletal muscles.
As we have discussed earlier in our overview about the nervous system, there are voluntary and involuntary movements. One type of involuntary movements is reflexes. Reflex is a response to a stimulus. A reflex is made possible by neural pathways called reflex arcs, which can act on an impulse before the impulse reaches the brain. And there are several types of human reflexes. In line with this, there is also a tendon reflex That is the contraction of a muscle in response to striking its tendon. And the Golgi tendon reflex, that is the inverse of a stretch reflex. A newborn baby is also equipped with basic reflexes. Infants have several reflexes that are not seen in adults.
The several infant reflexes are: first, the grasp reflex. The grasp reflex is when you place an object firmly in an infant's hand, the infant will grasp it. 2. Is the Babinski reflex. The Babinski reflex is when you stroke the sole of the foot, the infant extends the big toe and fans the others. 3. The rooting reflex. The rooting reflex is when you touch an infant's cheek, the infant turns his or her head toward the stimulated cheek and begins to suck. The rooting reflex is not a pure reflex, as its intensity depends on the infant's arousal and hunger level.
Now, let's move on to the brain mechanisms of movement. The major motor areas of the mammalian central nervous system are the cerebral cortex, and especially the primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex is the main source of brain input to the spinal cord. The spinal cord contains central pattern generators that actually control the muscles. Areas near the primary motor cortex, including prefrontal cortex, premotor cortex, and supplementary motor cortex. So, prefrontal cortex responds to lights, noises, and other signals for a movement. It also plans movement according to their probable outcome. And premotor cortex is active during the preparation for a movement and less active during the movement itself. While supplementary motor cortex is responsible in planning and contribution of complex movement. Next to the cerebral cortex is the cerebellum. Cerebellum has traditionally been considered a major part of the motor system that regulates equilibrium and helps coordinate balance and voluntary movements. The cerebellum also has multiple roles in the behavior, including sensory functions related to perception of the timing or rhythm of stimuli. People with cerebellar damage have trouble with tapping a rhythm, clapping hands, pointing at a moving object, speaking, writing, typing, or playing a musical instrument. People with cerebellar damage are impaired at almost athletic activities, except those like sports that do not require aim or timing. Next to the cerebellum is the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia are essential for learning motor habits that are really difficult to describe in words. For example, you are telling or teaching someone how to tie their shoelace, but the procedure is hard to explain with words. So you just gotta do it with action so that they would understand. So basal ganglia is responsible for it. We are done discussing about movements and its connection with the nervous system. We have also discussed its brain mechanism. So now, Let's move to movement disorders. There are many types of movement disorders, but I'm gonna tackle about Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease. Let's talk about Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is an illness that affects the part of your brain that controls how you move your body. It can come on so slowly that you don't even notice it at first. But over time, what starts as a little shakiness in your hand can have an impact on how you walk, talk, sleep, and think. There is no cure for Parkinson's disease, but you can get treatment and support to manage the symptoms.
What does Parkinson's disease do to the brain?
Deep down in our brain, there is an area called substantia nigra. Some of its cells make dopamine, a chemical that carries messages around your brain. When that system is working well, your body moves smoothly and evenly. But when a person has Parkinson's disease, the cells of its substantia nigra starts to die. There's no replacing them, so the dopamine levels drop and it can fire off as many messages to control your body. We're done with Parkinson's disease, and now let's move to Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is an inherited disease that causes the progressive breakdown of nerve cells in the brain. Huntington's disease has a broad impact on a person's function ability and usually results in movement, thinking, and psychotic disorders.
What causes Huntington's disease?
Huntington's disease is caused by an inherited defect in a single gene. Huntington's disease is an autosomal dominant disorder, which means that a person needs only one copy of the defective gene to develop the disorder. With the exception of genes on the sex chromosomes, a person inherits 2 copies of every gene, 1 copy from each parent. A parent with a defective gene could pass along the defective copy of the gene to the healthy copy.
Let's have a look back. The 2 movement disorders, which is the Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease. The brain mechanism of movement, the basal ganglia, cerebellum, and the cerebral cortex, especially the primary motor cortex. The different reflexes, and the connection of movement with the nervous system.
Let's now have a recap about the study. Movements of the body are brought about by the harmonious contraction and relaxation of selected muscles. Contraction occurs when nerve impulses are transmitted across neuromuscular junctions to the membrane covering of each muscle fiber. Most muscles are not continuously contracting, but are kept in a state ready to contract. The slightest movement or even the intention to move results in widespread activity to the muscles of the trunk and root.
The study of movement is not just about the study of muscles, but also it is a study of how we decide on what to do. Now, we're done discussing about movement and its connection with the nervous system. I hope you learned a lot and thank you very much. Bye!